inside of our group, inside of our organization, and very often we are the ones waging the war of imagination on ourselves, right? And to me, there's one thing that I always think about when I think about fighting the war on imagination, right? Fighting the war against, this war on imagination. And it's really one of my favorites, when I think about how do we celebrate the principles that we have, where we recognize when it's time to let go of our rules that are expired. So I always say, I like to question myself and say, well, whenever we can, let's break our rules but not our principles. And what I mean by that is that I'm not saying that rules are not useful. Rules are very useful. But there comes a time where rules might be outdated. Rules might not work anymore, but we still pretend and treat them as they are principles. And I want to give you an example, maybe perhaps one of my, favorite example of that. You probably know Philippe Petit, amazing artist. He's one of my great inspiration. Philippe Petit is an artist who at the age of 14 years old saw a newspaper in France that 2 towers were going to be built, the biggest, tallest towers in the world, that were the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And he decided at the age of 14 to have this impossible, beautiful dream, which was simply, one day, I will put a tightrope between those 2 towers and I will walk for 45 minutes with no security between those 2 towers. And he actually did in 1973, I believe, he actually accomplished this, and these are actually pictures of what he did then. So for me, there's this notion of, again, making sure that as much as we can think of, at the very least, one project, one objective that really feels impossible and beautiful. So how do we bring this back to something very concrete, which is just, this framework? 30 years ago, there was this principle, very serious principle, which said you cannot, and it was usually said with a lot of authority, you cannot, put a wall and a trampoline next to each other, because it's dangerous, and nobody really questioned it. Of course, you had some experimentation on angles of those trampolines, but in essence, you do not put a trampoline next to a wall because it's too dangerous. So, in this spirit of caring first, in the spirit of asking what if, one of my favorite persons at Cirque du Soleil, I consider him, for those of you who are familiar with Star Wars, my kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi, but he asked this question, well, what if we were to take a trampoline and a wall and put them next to each other? What would happen? What if, right? So what we did, in a way to care first, is that, they went around the world to find some of the best trampoline artists of the time, and, they were all brought to Cirque. And, I mentioned this idea of securing safety. When you want to push the boundaries of performance, when you want to push the boundaries of innovation in movement, especially when it comes to acrobats, the first thing that you do is not to say, jump. No. No, the first thing that you do is you make absolutely sure that it's very clear for everyone in the team where the safeties are, where the nets are, where the security is. And my question for you is it really clear for your teams where that security is? Where those nets are they really visible? Can they really see those nets and those safeties? But for me, when we think about pushing innovation, discovering new things, caring, so understanding the superpowers of people in the team, and then creating that safety, it's like the baseline. I'm not saying that it's impossible to discover new movement without safety, but it's much more dangerous and the risks are much higher. And once we do that, what it does is that it creates its foster trust. Okay, this is an environment where we're going to push the boundaries, but it's actually a safe environment. There are safeties, so I can start to trust. I can start to have that connection. And I think for me, it's, for me, trust is really more of a decision. So it's one of the reasons why I love this quote from Hemingway so much. This idea of really taking that decision to, offer, to give that trust. And it allows us to do this fundamental thing. When we think about creativity, we typically think about that. We think about playing. But for me, it's really about, when we want to push the boundaries, it's really about playing with danger, playing with our own limitations, and to turn them into advantages. So we did that, there was a lot of exploration that was done, but I must say, none of them worked. So after a couple of weeks, there was still no insights, no discovery, and discouragement was starting to sink in. So one day, the legend wants that Boris Berkowski arrived at the beginning of the session with a bottle of vodka. And he said to the team, this is a bottle of vodka. I'm going to put it on the top of that wall. And whoever manages today, tomorrow, next week, to go on top of that wall, gets the bottle. Simple. I don't know why we didn't think about this before, but anyway. And sure enough, you already know the story. What happened is that, of course, eventually one person, through suddenly changing those limitations to something that was a little bit more playful, a little bit more of a playful competition. A first trampoline artist grabbed a bottle, yay. But for me, that's not really the most interesting part of the story. The most interesting part of the story is that after, when everybody went home that night and started to dream about what had happened, I think that people start to say, wait a minute, I can do it too. If he did it, I can do it too. And of course, there was this breakthrough, and what's really fun, what's really interesting when you think about it, is that today, you have kids, mom and dads, doing exactly that, playing with trampolines and walls, where 30 years ago, even elite athletes would not dare to do something like this. And for me, that's kind of a definition of growth, right? It's a definition of creating those connections and creating something that feels relevant for the people that we create with. But I mentioned that as well. I think that when we think about growing and we think about winning, I think sometimes we overlook this idea that we can also crash. I really remember after the creation of Michael Jackson 1, a little bit before the premiere, we knew we had something, we still needed to figure out if we were going to have a good premiere, but I knew that we worked so hard that I kind of crashed a little bit. Emotionally, I was drained. And what I learned from that experience is that it would have been a real act of leadership to also plan for recovery, And, for me, there's this really very special phrase, because I'm a big fan of tennis, and there's sometimes when things get really crazy, I start to think about this phrase of Billie Jean King, that pressure is a privilege, right? So it's like winning is a privilege, right? But I think it's true only if we have a recovery plan. So only if we can think of that cycle, those 7 dimensions, if we add that additional one, which is going back to care. We grow, but we make sure that we remember that this is a practice. It's not a destination. So I encourage you, like I think that there's something very simple that can be done both from an individual standpoint, but also more on a collective one, is to do this kind of scan. You could really take that model, and no matter what is the leadership style that you have, you could really take that model and start to ask yourself, just look at the score intuitively, and the lowest of those scores might be where, maybe there's some attentions that needs to be put there. I do this kind of scan, once a month to try to see where is the team, and sometimes it surprises me. Oh, you know what? I thought we were really good with play, but I think we need to work a little bit more on this. What could we do? Let's organize, a group curling experience. Let's do something that will help trigger a little bit more playing spirit inside of the team. Very often we're in a very big growth period right now. So because there's a lot of growth, it really affects the level of care. So how do we rebalance that and making sure that there's more harmony between those different elements? So today what we did was going a little bit over this idea and proposing to you this idea that you're all master gardeners, that you can all integrate inside of your own practice, distinctive practice of leadership, this idea that you're master gardeners. And what you're gardening, beyond that framework, is you're gardening all those superpowers that you have inside of your teams. One of the things that I love to do is, when I start a new project, I will map the superpowers of the people in my team, and based on those superpowers, I will try to give a collective identity, so a collective superpower to my team. And as I manage that team and lead that team, it sometimes becomes very useful to have this kind of perspective on that team. We also saw that, the war in imagination is not in a distant country really, really far away from here. It's actually very often right inside of our heart when we don't pay attention to it. And of course, I've shared with you those 7 dimensions of, what I really think it takes to cultivate, to continue to use the growing, metaphor, what it takes to cultivate a truly innovative, creative, culture. So, I went back and eventually shared with you, that special night of June 29, 2013. So I couldn't leave you without telling you why, my girlfriend was pulling my arm so hard while I just trying to watch the show